Hello and welcome back to a new Beaver Hunter scale models video. In today's video I want to show you how I built this Panther D by Tamiya and customize it with weld beads, the armoured texture, Zimmerit and photo etch parts. This is a full packed video, so let's get started. Okay, my plan is to build a diorama with a field workshop scene, and today's video will be about building the tank, for which I have a lot of accessories here. I started with building the basic shape of the tank, so to say the chassis, and I needed this to start with the first interesting techniques like armoured texture, renewing weld beads and applying the Zimmerit. Some details had to be removed, like the plastic fenders, so I could replace them with photo etch parts later. The build was pretty much straightforward. There were no fitting problems and the parts fitted together like a dream. Of course, I had to place all the details from the inside before I could glue the upper and lower hull together. And I removed some casted details that I want to replace with photo etch parts later. And this is how it looked after I completed the basic build. Before I glued the upper and lower hull together, I started to remove the casted weld beads with a scribing tool. The casted welds didn't look that bad, but I wanted to try out creating my own custom welds, and so I had to remove them. A metal ruler is very helpful to guide the scribing tool if you have to scribe out welds that are not deepened. And after the first passes with using the ruler, the gaps are deep enough to guide the scribing tool. On places like these edges, I couldn't use the ruler to guide the scribing tool, so I first started with using my Dremel to remove the casted welds and then used the scribing tool to deepen them. Needless to say, I was a bit nervous working with the Dremel and I needed a steady hand here. Before I could glue the upper and lower hull together, I needed to build and paint the engine. I kept it simple here because 90% of the engine won't be visible later in the finished model anyway. So I built it out of the box without adding additional details like wires or hoses. I just wanted to get this piece done and move on to the fun stuff. I also added just one air filter because the other one is removed by a mechanic. And I kept the weathering simple too, with a dark brown wash to imply some dirt and grease. And some dust with a dry earth product to imply the dust that would accumulate on a hot and greasy engine. Then I could finally glue the engine in place. And with that done, I could glue the upper and lower hull together. I then grabbed me a sharp hobby knife and started to rework the flame cuts. These two weren't that bad on the casted parts, but I wanted to refine them so that after painting they will be highlighted more. And this too was one of the many techniques I wanted to give a try on this model. And after carving the flame cuts and removing the welds, I smoothed out everything with extra thin plastic cement. Now slowly the fun part began. I use Tamiya's Basic Putty and extra thin plastic cement to mix me a thin paste for applying armored texture. This was then applied on the thicker side plates by stippling, and it gives the surface a nice textured look of a rolled steel surface. And I could fill the holes for the plastic parts, which I won't use because I will replace them with photo etch parts. For the more tight places I used a smaller brush and could reach them without any problems here. And again, any gaps like this one on the commander's cupola could be filled with putty easily. When I was done, I cleaned the brush using regular plastic cement, and like this I could remove any putty leftovers in the brush and they're good to go for the next time. But of course they won't be good for figure painting anymore, so it's good to always have some old brushes for jobs like this. I then use some fine sanding paper for a quick round of sanding the texture and removing any pickles. With the texture done, I could finally start adding the welds. I used green stuff for this job because I have plenty of it and didn't want to buy the Tamiya epoxy putty. I mixed the two parts until they turned green and then rolled it into very thin noodles. I therefore wetted the putty with a brush and then used two styrene parts to roll them out very thin. I then placed the thin noodles on the model and used a moistened toothpick to press it into the gaps. And I made sure to fill out the gaps completely with the putty. I then used a self-made C-shaped tool out of copper foil. This was built by bending the copper foil around the drill bit and then glue it onto a cocktail stick. And with that, keeping it moist, I could press the C-shaped weld beads into the putty. As a next step, and before starting to apply the Zimmerit, I marked all positions of tool or spare track holders, and with that I knew where not to apply Zimmerit and place the photo etch parts. Then it was finally time for the Zimmerit. I really liked the approach of Uncle Nightshift on his Jagd Panther, and I wanted to give this method a try. So I mixed the Tamiya Smooth Putty and applied it with a moistened toothpick in a very thin layer. As this was the first time I'm using this technique, I wasn't sure in advance if this is a job that would take me 2 hours or 2 days. As it turned out, it would more likely be 2 days, but as this project has a lot of first times for me, time was not really a matter. When I started this project, I of course knew there would be a lot of first times, and so I couldn't say how long this build would take me. Would it be 4 weeks? Would it be 8 weeks? And I needed 6 weeks to complete this build, and that was totally fine for me, as I prefer being satisfied with the result instead of being quick. As I want to create the square tile pattern, after smoothing out the applied epoxy putty, I marked the positions of the vertical lines, and I then used longer or shorter blades to cut the square tile pattern into the fresh applied epoxy putty layer. Of course, surfaces like the sides of the turret or the hull were more easy to do because there were no obstacles or any details. Places like the lower hull were a real pain because there were all the parts from the running gear, and that didn't make it easier to move the blade and make as straight as possible cuts. But there is a point some of you may have noticed already. I'm building a Panther D here, which is the early type, and the square tile pattern was usually applied on the middle or late types. So it's almost impossible that this tank came out of the factory with the square tile pattern Zimmerit. And although it's not very likely, I think no one can really say that it's impossible that there was no vehicle having this square tile pattern applied later in the field. And the most important point, this is my model and I liked the pattern and I wanted to give it a try, and nothing could stop me here. After cutting the horizontal and vertical lines, I let it rest for half an hour, and then I grabbed me a blunt knife and widened the cuts with that. Small imperfections could easily reformed with a moistened toothpick, and of course you have to be careful to not touch the still soft putty so you don't have any fingerprints on it. The side plates were also more easy to work on because they have a big area without any obstacles, and I here applied the putty around the in advance marked positions of the tool holders. Here I could also use the longer blade, and that made it easier for me to cut straight lines into the putty. And like I said earlier, this pattern on this tank was most likely applied later in the field. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but obviously I tried to be as accurate as possible. I'm not sure yet how successful I was here, and I guess I will be wiser when there will be some paint on it later. But here you can see how easy it is to create battle damage or clean up the maybe not so sharp edges, and this was very rewarding after all this work. After it was fully dry, I grabbed me some fine sanding paper and very gently sanded away the protruding pimples and give it a smoother finish. Okay, this is the finished result, and like I said, I'm not yet sure how I like it and how it will be looking after painting. But it was totally worth making this experience, and maybe now know what I'm not doing in the future. The lower hull was the area where I started because I thought it would be a good practice ground with all the running gear and earth and mud covering it later. And it's a good thing that it will be covered because this was a really tough area to practice on with all the running gear in the way. You could not move the blade freely, and maybe it would be easier to start practicing on an empty area like the side or the turret. Maybe this is a lesson learned, and now I could finally move on and assemble the running gear. This was finally again a pretty straightforward build, and I added some damage to the rubber wheels with my hobby knife and smoothing it out with extra thin plastic cement. Then I mounted the wheels to the swing arms, and after that I used super glue to make all these wheels one part. Like this I can paint the whole wheels as one unit and don't have to mess around with all those single wheels. Because this will be a field workshop scene, I removed some running wheels and customized this jack. So like this I can create a scene where the mechanics will be working on the swing arm or the running wheels. To replace the plastic handles, I grabbed me some copper wire and bended it into shape. I herefore used a handle bending tool, which was very helpful to bend the wire into 90 degrees. Then I drilled through the holes where the handles will be, placed them and glued them with super glue from the inside. I painted the fans black before attaching the covers because I wasn't sure how I could reach them later with primer. Then it was a good time to add some battle damage. I therefore used a conical Dremel tool and grinded some holes into the places where the Zimmerit was damaged. I then used Vallejo's Plastic Putty and filled it into the holes. I then used a moistened toothpick and pressed it into the filled holes, and like this the putty came out on the sides and bulged up. And after a few more minutes of drying, I reworked the edges with the toothpick to simulate melted metal from the impact. Photo edge parts. Photo edge parts were my nemesis in the past. I really tried to avoid small parts like tool clamps or moving stuff like this here and just do the bigger parts like fenders. But again, I wanted to go the full distance on this model, so I ordered me 2 sets of photo edge parts. The basic set with all additional equipment and the fender and side skirt part. And stuff like these side skirt holders were really a pain for my eyes and my nerves. Some bigger parts like these fenders I expected to be more easy, but as it turned out, they gave me more trouble than I expected. So it's a good thing I'm building a tank here and can hide this with some battle damage. Because with all these side skirt holders in the way, I expected trouble when mounting the tracks later. So I applied Vallejo's Plastic Putty over these parts and make a stronger bond to the hull. And this turned out to be a very good idea because, like I expected, mounting the tracks later turned out to be a nasty job. I also wanted to try soldering photo edge parts, and these storage boxes for the back of the Panther were the perfect parts to try it. And after testing on some spare pieces and using this pen with soldering liquid, this worked out pretty well. And as hoped, these parts were more stronger than I expected them to be with using super glue. Of course you can see here that I'm no soldering ninja, so I grabbed me my sanding sticks and smoothed everything out and polished it. This again was totally worth the effort and I'm very happy that I gave it a try. The hinges for these boxes were again parts from the category photo edge from hell. But I was somehow able to finish them too, and here you can see me gluing them to a very battle damaged storage box. And with the brush here I'm using debonder to remove excess super glue. And to say I'm proud about these finished storage boxes is a slight underestimation. For the storage tube of the gun cleaning rods, I used the plastic part as a template. And because this is a bigger part, I heated it until it turns purple black and tried to roll it around the template. I'm not sure if it was because of the heating in advance, but there was no way I could solder this part together. There was just no way the solder would stick to the PE part and I totally ruined the part here. I tried cleaning it with water and alcohol, but there was no way that this would work. So I grabbed me some 0.1mm thick copper foil and had to rebuild this from scratch. And this time the soldering worked as I hoped it would and I finally could finish this part. All additional parts like the spare track holders with these tiny chains were of course a challenge too. But the more time I spent with the photo edge parts, I somehow learned or maybe improved my skills and it became more and more fun. I'm not sure if I will go the full distance with photo etched parts in the future. Maybe I will use more 3D printed parts for tool clamps, for example. But again, getting the experience was totally worth the effort and the pain, and I'm super proud looking at this model right now, and I will be very sad when the time comes for priming. I also learned that I was really bad at bending straight parts round. But even this got better, like these spare track holders for the turret. So with patience and time the parts lost their fear somehow. Movable parts like these hinges for the hatch were a nightmare for me in advance, but I even was able to finish these. Then there were some leftover tasks like welding the plastic details or photo etch details in place, and I here use the same technique like on the bigger weld beads on the hull. Of course these welds were much smaller and a bit more difficult to create. And as my confidence has raised a bit until this point, I reworked areas like these where I originally had no plans to do welds. To add some additional details, I tried to create some tarps out of green stuff. I therefore rolled it very thin using baby powder to avoid it from sticking to the tools. And with the help of a silicone brush I tried to place it and create somehow natural folds. I'm not saying that this is a perfect result, but for my again first time I'm very happy. To create custom-made towing cables I used electric wires. I used 4 wires and twisted them together with my screwdriver. Made a second one and twisted these two together. The ends were then glued into the plastic eyelets and closed with Tamiya Basic Putty. Of course, after that was dry, I sanded it to give it a smooth finish. On the muzzle brake I had to close a gap, so I here too used Basic Putty, and after some sanding the part was looking fine. I added some bullet damage to the dismounted running wheels, and this will be the reason why the mechanics are working on it. Then I could finally mount the PanzerArt resin tracks, which are pretty nice to build. And here I was very happy that I supported the side skirt holders with putty. And it's a good thing that I only had to close one track, because the other one will be open because of the mechanics working on it. The side skirts could be mounted to the tank too after they received the Zimmerit and some battle damage. And after some last details to make this model even more unique and mine, I can finally call this build done. This was the most exhausting, complicated and time-consuming tank build I ever did. But seeing it standing in front of me like this was totally worth the pain, the tears and the blood. I will now gain some courage to prime this whole thing, but until then I will enjoy looking at it. I hope you found this video interesting to watch. I would be very happy if you leave me some feedback or consider subscribing. And if I maybe caught your attention and you want to see this build painted and weathered, stay tuned for upcoming videos. So all left is say thank you for watching my video, and stay safe and goodbye.